Thank you all very much, and it is a wonderful thing to be here. My job this afternoon is to talk to you about some of the innovative ideas that are happening around the world that suggest that cooperatives have a very bright future as true innovators. We tend to think of Silicon Valley in California as the innovators. That's not necessarily the case, and so I'm going to talk about a number of examples this afternoon that hopefully will inspire us to think about what we can do to solve global problems together. And I'm going to concentrate, because this is an area that I know best, on energy, and specifically on renewable energy, and also in relationship to what can go wrong when something like Fukushima Daiichi happens. You know that better than I, but we work with the Nuclear Energy Institute in the United States, and they had responsibility for coming over immediately to look at the safety issues and the precautions. And so I'm somewhat familiar with that situation as well. And I only wish I could have attended your disaster recovery conference, because I think that this is an area for the future that we all have much to share. So let me start with an area that Mr. Asada touched on, and that is the question of food security, local food. And as you can see in the paper, the summary that I shared with you, there is a great discussion going on today around the food, water, and energy connection. If you think about some of the early production of electricity, it was done with hydroelectricity, water. If you think about power plants today, whether it's a nuclear plant, a coal plant, a natural gas plant, they all require water intake and water output. Think about the irrigation requirements in many areas of the world that do not have sufficient rainfall for agriculture. Water is absolutely critical. And as we all also know, water is critical to life. If we can only have one thing, it would be water. And then we look at the world in terms of droughts, displacement for causes that we believe are related to changes in the atmosphere. Are those permanent changes? If they're permanent changes, what do we do about it? I heard an Israeli talk about the agricultural movement in Israel, who said, as cooperatives in Israel, we need three things from the government. We need help in making sure that the electric grid is reliable. We need help in making sure that we can set up sufficient irrigation systems to make sure the crops are good, and we need help to make sure that the roads are sufficient that we can get our food to market without it rotting on the way. Once that is done, the government should get out of our way and let us run the cooperatives as cooperatives. And it was quite a powerful statement that he was making, and he made that statement in a meeting in Africa, in Cape Town, during the ICA General Assembly. It's interesting that the founder of the Irish cooperative movement was a good friend of President Theodore Roosevelt at the beginning of the 20th century, and strongly advised Roosevelt to think of a public policy around the need to establish agricultural cooperatives as fundamental to the survival of farms and ranches in the American West. His name was Horace Plunkett, and he won the day because, in fact, Theodore Roosevelt did advise the Congress that as you look at economic development in rural America, think of hydroelectric power, number one, and number two, think about agricultural cooperatives as absolutely necessitated if we're going to have sustainable agriculture in the United States. There are many, many discussions going on globally right now about dealing with this relationship between energy, and specifically electricity, water, and food. And we're going to see much more of that. We're going to see crises around water supply. And I would argue that if you look around the world, you'll see in many cases there are water cooperatives. In the case of the U.S., there are electric cooperatives and food cooperatives, whether starting with agricultural cooperatives, as we've talked quite a bit in the past couple of days here, or even grocery cooperatives are growing in importance around the world. So I can imagine that the cooperative business model could be the best focus of attention on solving this interrelationship so that it works in harmony in terms of how we supply our electricity, how we make sure we have water supply, and how we make sure we have abundant local food supplies. Secondly, on renewable energy. As we all know, there's talk all over the globe about solar energy in particular, the costs coming down, the fact that many people think that solar can increase dramatically around the world, and it can, but it's probably going to be the cooperatives that make that happen. In Germany, what they call the Energiewende, which is the energy transition, has resulted in about 500 small Bavarian cooperatives, typically farms and farmhouses with rooftop photovoltaic power on those houses, all flowing into the German grid. In England, Wales, and Scotland, there are approximately 200,000 people who are now receiving renewable energy as 100% of their energy through the cooperative group, which is basically a group that aggregates in a lot of different services for members. In the United States, the largest per capita installation of photovoltaic energy is Kauai, on the island of Hawaii, which is now a cooperative, Kauai Cooperative, the largest concentration of photovoltaics on a per capita basis. There are 4 cooperatives in Costa Rica. Those 4 cooperatives have always been hydroelectric cooperatives. They now have significant solar energy and some wind energy connected in as well. And I just happened to check my email at the break, and I found an announcement of one of our own members in Colorado who has announced a community solar garden. A community solar garden is a set of arrays of solar panels that's in an area large enough to support a significant amount, and people will then buy a panel or more than one panel and get a discount on their electric bill. And the cooperatives are the ones that are innovating on this idea. But what's so interesting here is that this is exclusively available to members who qualify as low income. Quite interesting. And the offset on their electric costs is going to be up to 90%. 90%. So that's going to be an interesting thing to keep an eye on. But I would also submit, just as I did with water, energy, and food, that in solar energy and wind, cooperatives could show global leadership. There are issues there, let's be clear, in terms of how you integrate those renewable resources into the electric grid, how they balance against existing resources. But it's the ingenuity of cooperatives that can make that happen best, I would argue. We do work in sub-Saharan Africa, and it's interesting to think about what cooperatives can deliver in areas of the world that have no electricity source at the present time. There are 1.5 billion people in the world who have no electricity. 1.5 billion with a B. In sub-Saharan Africa, there are 500 million. Now, that in itself is a recipe for disaster if we think about what's happening in the world regarding economic instability and the consequences of economic instability. So how do we work together to ensure that we can improve that circumstance? We had a situation in South Sudan, which is now, as you know, a republic, broken off from Khartoum, where there was nothing after the Civil War. And we were asked to come in and put together electric systems on a cooperative basis. And there are now 4 small electric systems. One of them is a cooperative, the other 3 are community-based, and we hope they will become cooperatives. All of the materials had to come in from Uganda because there was nothing, there was no infrastructure whatsoever. They now have lights, they can power motors. The cell phone business is growing dramatically. The U.S. government is talking to us about how we also now need to look at education around productive agriculture and sustainable agriculture. It's a significant change for this new country, the newest country on earth, that is really struggling. But without that electricity source, it would be worse. We are piloting a project there in one of the small towns called Meridi, where instead of just using diesel generation, which is typically what's being used in off-grid development in sub-Saharan Africa, where you don't have a grid tie to the electric grid, We're going to be putting in solar to reduce the cost of diesel at the peak usage of electricity. And we think that that can reduce it so much that it'll actually be a price that's competitive with costs in the United States today. And that is stunning. That's a use of solar that is truly innovative. That's looking at it as offsetting significant costs, which would be so prohibitive that people would not actually be able to pay for the electricity that was now available in that service territory. Mr. Assad also talked about the natural disaster issue, in that Japan is a natural disaster-prone country, and we certainly know that. And we spent yesterday in Fukushima and saw the brilliant work that's being done through the JA system to recover, particularly the work that was done on radioactive monitoring. You should all be very proud of the work that's been done there. And that's an example of the values of self-help and self-responsibility that occurred when you could say it wasn't our fault, it's not our problem, but in fact, to get that fruit and those fruits and vegetables back to the market, you had no choice but to roll up your sleeves and make it happen. And I think that's a great example of cooperation and getting things done. You know that situation far better than I, so I'll give you two other quick examples where we need to continue to work together around the future of the electric system as it relates to disaster recovery. Because once that electric system is down, if it's down for a long time, it can rip the social fabric apart. So we have the Philippines with the typhoon that occurred 2 years ago, November. That entire area of central Philippines where the typhoon came through is electric cooperative service territory. We helped build it. Even the large town of Tacloban that was so hard hit that you saw all the pictures of in the news, that had to be rebuilt. But here's the point about disaster recovery. It's about resiliency. How do you make sure the next time it's not as bad? How can you rebuild in such a way that you're rebuilding to a higher level of performance of the system? That system could not withstand greater than a Category 3 hurricane or typhoon. This was beyond Category 5. At the time, it was the worst registered storm in history. So how do you think creatively about that? That can be done through increasing the level of standards, which we are working with the Philippine government and the Philippine cooperatives on, and it could be a global standard if we really want to think hard about how these types of very extreme storms can be weathered. And that's not just about electricity, that's about telecommunications. That's about financial services. That's about food availability. That's about water availability. And again, I would say that the cooperative model is the best example of how we can work together in advance of that type of storm to build resiliency plans in ways that other types of organizations are not going to be able to do that. I think working with other NGOs is a great idea as well, but if we start with cooperation among cooperatives, I think we can make great progress. In Haiti, there was the earthquake that occurred in January 2010. There were 160,000 people killed, people displaced. We were the first responders, my organization were the first responders on electricity. And I'm proud to point out that an employee of our organization, a 35-year employee, was the first one in who knew anything about how to fix the generators for the hospital. And he asked permission to go. He arrived 4 days after the earthquake, and he was asked to run the utility because the national utility was in shambles. There was no one there to run it. He managed that utility for 6 months on our payroll. That's cooperation on a global sense. 4 days after he arrived, he personally had fixed the generator, reconnected it to the hospital, and the hospital for the first time had electricity. We've never taken credit for that. I'm not telling you the story in order to take credit for that. I'm telling you the story as an example of how cooperatives really work, often behind the scenes, to improve the quality of life, especially in a disaster circumstance. So I could see an opportunity for us to continue to work on these issues as a global cooperative system, and disaster recovery and resiliency is one of those great examples. We're also working with the World Council of Credit Unions in Haiti on a long-term project that involves now rural electrification on the cooperative model and educating people on how to use mobile banking. You have many people in Haiti who take the cash and try to make sure they can hide it somewhere in their home so it's not stolen. How do you move from there to any kind of an understanding of savings or protecting your money? So we're moving to a discussion with the credit union system about mobile banking and teaching people how to use their cell phone to understand that paycheck can go directly into an electronic account, and they can learn to manage that and budget from it. Another example of innovation. My final example of innovation is Cuba. Certainly you've read the softening of relations between the United States and Cuba. It's real. It's going to happen. I'm part of a working group for the U.S. on cooperative development in Cuba. Chuck Gould was there a couple of weeks ago looking at that from an International Cooperative Alliance point of view. There are new Cuban cooperatives being formed. We're encouraging them to join the ICA Americas region so that they have a support system. The fascinating part of this discussion is that the Cuban government is encouraging the creation of cooperatives as a transition model. In other words, taking government services and moving them into worker cooperatives. We visited a clothing manufacturing cooperative that 9 months before they'd been government workers. They were now owners of the co-op, and very, very proud that they now had the responsibility to figure out what to do with the margins that they would make. Fascinating discussions. An auto mechanics cooperative. Previously had been a government auto mechanics store. Now they're fixing automobiles as owners of that. It was a great experience. There's a long way to go, but keep your eye on this because it could be one of the greatest experiments regarding cooperatives in our history, a cooperative society being built right in front of our eyes, and we all have the opportunity to help make that happen in a positive way. So those are examples that are happening today, which are examples, I believe, of this incredible opportunity we have to change the world through our own ability to cooperate together with best practices, in some cases setting standards, like standards for disaster recovery and resiliency. And I'd like to end on a point that I try to keep in conversations because, and Chuck said this, in 1995, when in Manchester, England, the International Cooperative Alliance codified the principles and values and added the 7th principle. We then moved on to talk a lot about the principles, and Jean-Louis Vincel is working very hard on the Principles Committee. I want to add the piece about the values. The values that were codified in Manchester are self-help, self-responsibility, democracy, equity, equality, and solidarity. Self-help, self-responsibility, democracy, equity, equality, and solidarity. There is not an investor-owned company on the globe that can claim those values. Not one. They could claim aspects of the principles, and I've actually seen articles that talk about the idea that corporations can, in fact, operate similarly to those principles, so what is the big deal? Well, we argue against that quite effectively most of the time. But to think about what the world is looking for around the idea of self-help and self-responsibility, where institutions have failed them, that's the real spirit, I think, of the cooperative model. And our ability to work together to make sure those values are well understood by people who might otherwise not turn their head to think about a cooperative and the potential of a cooperative is a real dramatic opportunity we have in front of us. So I appreciate the opportunity to have spoken to you this afternoon. I think we have miraculous opportunities together to solve those very tough problems that the globe faces today, and we can do it proudly on the basis of the cooperative model. Thank you very much.